Hello and good morning to everybody. Welcome to this Linemen Safety Webinar presented by Bierer Meters and ECOS. My name is David McPeak. The first thing I want to do is to thank Brent Jeffries, all the folks at Bierer Meters for what they're doing for the industry, the electric culture of safety. Make sure you're involved in that. Really great community. Next month in July, make sure you tune in. July 18th, you've got Mr. Billy Martin coming, talking about human potential, moving from human performance to human potential. And then the next day, July 19th, you've got Mr. Christopher Jesse coming and talking about working with different generations. Very great topic for today. So again, thank you for the opportunity to be here, Brent Beer, and thank you for tuning in and watching. And now let's talk about the art of safety. And before I do that, I want to just introduce myself real quick. Again, David McPeak. I am the Director of Professional Development and Education at the Incident Prevention Institute of Utility Business Media. You can see some other stuff about me up there. A couple of things I'll point out. Down at the bottom you see I've written a couple of books, and the second book was called Frontline Incident Prevention, The Hurdle. That's what this presentation is based on a lot today. And then just a little bit about the company I work for, Utility Business Media. We focus on the utility industry. We publish a couple of magazines, Incident Prevention, Utility Fleet Professional. They're both free. Check those things out. The Incident Prevention Institute, my area of responsibility. Do a lot of education for the utility industry. We put on 2 conferences a year, the IP Utility Conference and Expo, and then manage the Certified Utility Safety Professional Certification. So just a little bit about me and where I come from, a lot of experience in the industry. And I want to talk now again about the art of safety. And when I say the art of safety, let me explain where I'm coming from. So people say, you've probably heard people say a lot, safety is both an art and a science. And I feel like we've gotten really, really good at the science of safety. And what I mean by that is think about how we protect ourselves from hazards, our ability to identify hazards. If I'm getting in a confined space, there's all sorts of meters that can tell me exactly, for gases, whatever else, what the hazards are. I know how to protect myself. If I'm talking about maybe a fall hazard, we know based on how much I weigh and how high I am, how fast and how much force I may hit the ground with. If I'm in an excavation, we know how much soil weighs. There's a key point there, and we'll come back to this later, but hazards and risk are quantifiable and predictable. And if we can predict, we should be able to prevent. So then the obvious question there is, why do people get hurt? And I think that a large part of the reason for that is because we really don't understand what we're talking about today, the art of safety. And that's how to understand, how to lead, how to develop, how to manage people. And let's just jump in and talk about a few key principles associated with the art of safety. And the first one being to lead people and not robots. And I think that if you think about the difference between a person and a robot, this becomes very obvious why it makes sense. And this is just another way of thinking about human performance. Again, I'm really looking forward to next month on the 18th hearing Billy Martin talk about human performance and human potential. But think about it, a robot. And the point being, unintentionally, I think we try to create an environment where we're managing robots instead of leading people. And so if I tell a robot to do something, in other words, if I program that robot, it's going to do exactly what I tell it to do every single time. And it's going to do it, and things like risk tolerance, peer pressure, time pressure, all those sort of things, error precursors as we call them, they don't come into play. With people, when we tell them to do something or if we ask them to do something, they make judgments based on who's telling them whatever it is, the message that they're getting. They make a lot of judgments, and they're influenced by culture and systems. And that's really important because in order to really get safety right, has to start with getting the culture right. Everything we're going to talk about today will work no matter what your culture is, but it will be optimized in the right kind of culture. So I cannot stress enough, the title of the book, matter of fact, The Hurdle. Think about that. So getting people to buy into safety is a hurdle. And if you think about track and field, and I have a hurdle right here, and I'm trying to jump over it, if I start at a standing position and just try to jump over that hurdle, that's very difficult, if not impossible. The actually key is to get the run-up right. And the run-up, in this case, to a lot of the hurdles associated with safety is creating culture and developing relationships. So the better we can do that, and we'll talk through C5 leadership about how to do that. develop relationships, create culture, get that run up right, it becomes a whole lot easier to get over those hurdles. And the other thing about people is they should always be equal, but they're never the same. And I think in the application of our leadership, we fall victim to in trying to apply words like consistent and fair to mean that we need to treat everybody the same. Couldn't be farther from the truth. There's nothing more unfair you can do to a group of people than to treat everybody exactly the same. So in saying that, there's some implications for that. The implications are organizationally and for frontline workers, for people performing the work. For organizations, it's all about culture. That's why we're going to talk about C5 safety leadership. It's all about human performance, human factors, human performance improvement, whatever, tapping into that human potential. And it's about protecting workers rather than pleasing systems. And I'll talk in a little while about how we tend to fall victim to favoring pleasing systems over protecting workers. For individuals, this is people that are exposed to hazards. This is people performing work. You have to be self-reliant. You have to unnormalize deviation. And most importantly, the most important skill you have to be able to work safe is to be able to identify hazards, assess risk, and then protect yourself from hazards. There's great tools to do that, my favorite of which is the hierarchy of controls, and I'm going to explain that and talk about below the line and above the line work planning, so to speak. So let's talk about culture and leadership to start with, and how to really truly lead and protect people rather than managing robots and pleasing systems. And it starts with this: be a C5 safety leader. Now, this is a list of 5 words. This is not a comprehensive list in any form or fashion. But what this is, if you think about the 2 sources of leadership are your positional authority and your personal influence. And what we're talking about here is how to gain influence. And hear me say this, always remember this: safety will always work best when we're focusing on encouraging people to protect themselves from hazards and training them how to do that so that they want to, rather than forcing compliance and or making people follow rules. So with that said, C5 safety leadership is a strategy to increase your influence. The more we can do that, the more we create buy-in, the more we get our teams aligned. And so these 5 words in order, and I'll talk about the order: competence, how well you can do a job; commitment, how passionate you are; caring is going to be a very, very important word. And one of the mistakes I think that we make in safety is we tend to define caring as just preventing harm. And that's a huge part of safety. That's important. We need to do that. We have to prevent harm. But also encouraging growth, developing people. That goes back and ties into the commitment piece of it, and the encouraging credibility. Now notice credibility is last on this list. Not because it's the least important and at the bottom, but because it is the foundation on which everything else is built. People have to trust you, and you have to give, earn, and maintain trust. That's a very important role as a leader. In the middle of the list is caring. Again, preventing harm, encouraging growth. And in the interest of not being too long-winded about this one particular topic, a lot to talk about today, if you get that part of it right, everything else will fall into place. You have to care. And I hope you understand the difference between liking and caring. And when we're talking especially about safety and especially about leadership, you always have to factor caring over liking. It can't be your goal for everybody to like you. And it has to be the goal that everybody perceives and knows that you care about them. If you do that, all this stuff falls in. The interesting thing about this list is increasing any one of these will help you gain influence. Increasing any one of these will also help you increase the other 4. So let's think about like courage, for instance, how often you take action. And if you were here right now maybe, and I asked you, I just got tired of doing the presentation and said, I want to turn it over to you, finish the presentation. In the absence of competence, in other words, knowing this task, the rest of this presentation, you might not have a lot of courage. But if you're really well versed and competent at a task and can explain it to people, how much influence do you gain? I think every time I think about this list, I think about myself as a golfer. And I think about folks that are really good golfers. So I like to say this: I play golf. right? There are people that are golfers and there are people that play golf. So I hope you understand the difference between those two. I play golf. But I'm playing golf one day and a guy +3 handicap. If you don't know anything about golf, that means he shoots under par basically every time. One of the best golfers that I personally know and have ever met. And I call it the kindest insult that I've ever gotten in my life, but we finished playing around and he looks at me and he says, David, you're too athletic and you play too much golf to be this bad, okay? So start with a little bit of courage on his part to say that, right? But then caring and commitment. So what he tells me next is, I'm gonna meet you at the driving range tomorrow night. We're gonna work on a few things. And he meets me and he works on a few things. Courage on my part. Everything he told me was completely uncomfortable. I hated almost everything he told me to do. It just didn't feel right, but the more I tried it, the more it worked. And here's what happened. Really think about this. We went from an environment where he came to me and said, David, I want to help you, to as I started to improve, as he gained credibility in my mind. He had it from the position of authority, right? But as he continued to demonstrate commitment and caring, he now has it from an influence standpoint. And what starts happening is I go to him and I say, can you come watch me play? Here's what I'm doing. Here's what doesn't feel right. Here's what feels good. Give me feedback. There's another point about safety. Feedback always works best when it is solicited. Unsolicited feedback will happen. There's a time and a place for it. But ideally, if we get the culture of the relationships right, people will come to you and seek feedback. Two of the biggest cultural indicators you can tell is when somebody's going to do an audit or an observation, especially in the field, how people react to that person showing up, and also how many near misses, near hit get reported. So think about that. Now I'm going to him. I perceive him as the most competent and credible person for this task. Think about all the tasks that your team does at work. Competence in that task, and competence around the technical part of that job, and competence around some of the soft skills that we're talking about now, right? Like leadership, like safety, okay? So the most competent, credible person I know demonstrates some commitment. He wants to help me achieve my goals and shows me he cares. Took a little courage to start. How much influence did he gain? And we shift from us having, for this task anyway, of basically no relationship to I am literally going to him and asking him. So that's the kind of environment you want to create, and you do that through C5 safety leadership. The obvious place to start there, find ways to show people how much you care about them. If you do that, that's a huge part of that hurdle, that run up of getting over some of the hurdles that we're talking about. So C5 safety leadership, lead and protect people rather than managing robots and pleasing systems. So that's the leading people rather than robots part of it. Now, let's talk about protecting people rather than pleasing the system. And look at a couple of examples. And this is a list that I put together. It's not a comprehensive list, but I think the bottom one is kind of a really good example of what we do. Job briefings. And here's the thing. Think about the purpose of a job briefing. The purpose of a job briefing, it's one of the best safety tools that we have. But what it turns into a lot of times is, for compliance, we have a 10-minute conversation and we focus a whole lot more on the documentation than we do the actual conversation. And we don't really do a great job of understanding whether or not we've got mutual understanding at the end of it. Huge difference between communication and mutual effective communication, meaning it results in mutual understanding. But for systems, for us as safety professionals, for us as operational leaders, whatever the role we are, how do we evaluate job briefings? The truly correct way to evaluate a job briefing is maybe be there every now and then, but if you can't be there, I always say, if you show up on a job site, maybe find the person with the cleanest hard hat, meaning the newest person on the crew, ask them, hey, what'd you talk about in the job briefing this morning? What are your specific work assignments? What are some of the hazards you identify? How are you going to mitigate those hazards that you talked about? Unfortunately, the reality of it is, the way we evaluate job briefings is we show up on a job site and we just ask to see the documentation. And if we're happy with the documentation has pleased the system. Paper does not protect people. A sheet of paper will not protect people. That's the goal. Conversations, mutual understanding, hazard identification, risk assessment, and having conversations about those, do. But I almost guarantee you, everybody listening right now has at some point in time, either physically in person or just having somebody take a picture and text it to you or whatever it may be, evaluated the quality of a job briefing based solely on the documentation. And I think that's a great example. Others up here, do we really do incident investigations or analysis, including near misses, to gain understanding about what happened and be able to apply lessons, right? HP Principle 5. Events can be avoided from the application of lessons learned from past events or errors. When we have an incident, is it our goal to really learn those lessons so we can apply them? Or is it our goal to please whatever software system we're using and generate a report that maybe we're a contractor and our customer, the client that we're working for, is expecting a report, and as long as we generate that report, we're happy, whether we learn the lessons or not. When we do training's another great example, right? Are we happy that we've got documentation and training records with all the boxes checked, that we've done our required training? Now that's compliant. There's nothing wrong with compliance. I want to stress that. And we'll talk about settling for compliance later. But the thing I would say about safety is, what's more important? That the training happens, that somebody sit through a class, or that they actually learned and applied something? The only way you can do that is through training followed by evaluation and then coaching and feedback, that it becomes a continuous process. So really, and I've put together kind of an assessment that I think helps with this concept to help you determine whether you are protecting workers or pleasing the systems. And I want to say again, people don't do this with evil intent. They do it for what they perceive to be the right reasons, and a lot of times we don't realize we're doing it. But tie this back to C5 safety leadership with caring in the middle. If you care about people truly, you're probably going to do a lot of these things, protecting the worker. If you care more about the systems and pleasing systems and compliance, you're probably a little more over here. So a great way to do that is, by no means do you have to use this. I'm sure you have something similar, but a quick assessment on how we're pleasing the system. And think about some of these things. Observers are required to find something wrong during job site observations. If you've studied human performance at all, I love Principle 4. I'm always careful not to say it's my favorite principle, because I'll end up saying that 5 times, because all the 5 principles are great. But people achieve high levels of performance because of the support, encouragement, and reinforcement that they receive from leaders, peers, and subordinates. So rather than so much encouraging, you have to do 15 observations every quarter, and every time you do an observation, you have to find at least 3 things wrong. I mean, that's part of it. That's part of the process. We should always be learning. Why not find something right every now and then? Okay? And then evaluated based on the forms. We talked about all that. Number 4 is a big one. And I think people have really learned this lesson and learned it well. Is you can't focus on results alone. OSHA recordable rates, DART rates, incident rates, EMRs, all those sort of things, they're good. How many days it's been without an injury? Those are good directional indicators on how you're doing. But performance equals behavior plus results. And there we're just looking at results. Another thing about human nature, lead people, not robots, is when you give them a goal, they want to accomplish goals, and they'll do, most of the time, whatever they can to achieve those goals. The problem with that is if all I'm focused on is having 0 recordable injuries, that may not so much encourage safety as it does discourage reporting. And so you have to be very, very careful about what message you're actually sending. So think about those concepts. Lead and protect people rather than managing robots, pleasing systems. C5 safety leadership, focus on protecting the worker. The next thing is, and those are organizational things, and those are important. That again, creating culture, developing relationship, we need to get that stuff right, okay? But now I want to focus and spend the majority of our time on individual and team task performers. You are an individual, you work as part of a team, you work for an organization, there's tools to help you with all that. But the thing I want to stress is be responsible for your own safety. And I think unintentionally, and actually with very good intentions, we have created an environment where people feel so protected they don't really feel the need to protect themselves. And what I mean by that, think about this. You see these statements all the time. I am my brother's and sister's keeper. It's a great statement. I like it. You should be. I am responsible for my own safety. I like it. Sounds good. I can get into it. You probably got it on a bulletin board somewhere. Everyone is responsible for safety. Again, true statement. I like it. You probably got that one on your bulletin board too. In a world where everyone is responsible for safety, who actually does the work? And in a world where somebody else is my keeper and responsible for my safety, do I sometimes forget my actual role in my own safety? And so, in thinking about this safety paradox, if you will, paradox is a self-contradicting statement. I think kind of each one of these, if you really think about them, could be considered a paradox, but if we put the three of them together, they are. And I really want you to think about, great thing, most organizations that you work for now, they have good cultures. They have very good intentions. They want you to be safe. They're providing you all tons of training, leadership, support, protective equipment to help you work safer. And that's good. And then we have manufacturers, tools and equipment, Bierer Meters being one of them, right? And they've gotten really, really good at what they do. But I want you to think about risk tolerance. In a minute, we're going to talk about unnormalizing deviation. But risk tolerance. If I put on a pair of cut-resistant gloves, and I truly believe that they are 100% cut protection, right? Cut resistant. And that if I put them on, I'm invincible. How do I start to work? I believe that I'm invincible. And sooner or later, granted, compliment to the manufacturers, I might not get cut, but it's going to be a crushing kind of fracture injury or maybe even an amputation because I believe I'm invincible. We give people things called 100% fall protection or restriction while they're climbing poles. How does that impact my risk tolerance while I'm performing that task? We have vehicles now. As you're driving, they won't let you hit other stuff. They got sensors everywhere. They will put the brakes on for you. A lot of them have not backup. There's a big difference between a backup alarm or a camera and an actual collision avoidance system that will stop the vehicle for you. That's out there. And in a world where I believe that my vehicle will protect me from my mistakes while I'm driving, think about what that does to my risk tolerance. The point behind all this is this. As you're performing work, never neglect your responsibility to protect yourself. And sometimes we fall into the trap of what I call ABCDE. Accuse, blame, complain, defend and deny, or make excuses. And when something goes wrong or somebody gets hurt, we do those things. And sometimes it legitimately may be somebody else's fault, but you're the one that's hurt. You're the one that's had the injury. You're the ones this family is now affected. You're the one with pain and suffering, maybe out of work, other things like that. So in the book, this is called over-reliance versus self-reliance. And I want to talk about how to become more self-reliant. And in doing that, I want you to think about what is the most important PPE that you put on every day. Now, for a lot of valid reasons, people, the first thing for whatever reason, people usually say, and obviously this depends on what kind of task and work they do most of the time. A lot of people gravitate towards a hard hat because they like their head, they like their brain, they want to protect it. That's good. Folks that work in hazardous atmospheres tend to say they're respirators. Other people sometimes say they're rubber gloves if you're an electrical kind of worker or whatever it may be. All those are good, and I don't think we could pick one particular part or piece of PPE that's more important than the others. Obviously, the answer is whatever's appropriate and rated for the task being performed. Now, food for thought. We're going to come back to this later, but since I mentioned PPE, I want you to think about this. Two concepts. Number one, obvious, always protect your PPE so it can protect you. And number two, extraordinarily important concept is you should always use your PPE but never need your PPE. Say that again. You should always use your PPE but never need it. I'll explain what that means in a little while. For now, let's focus on this. And I propose to you, obviously this isn't real PPE that you're going to put on, but this is a mirror. This is a mirror. And in thinking about this concept of over-reliance on other people and things to protect us versus being self-reliant and protecting ourselves, it's got to start here. Because we think about hazards. We think about things that could hurt us. We do a good job of identifying, here's this trench that I could fall in. Here's this object over my head right now that could fall on me. Here's this electricity that could shock me. We do a good job of identifying those physical hazards. People as hazards. People can be hazards through their perception and their behavior. And really the only person that can truly and accurately, this is where a good point, if we do a great job of developing relationships, like we talked about earlier, and we demonstrate some of that C5 safety leadership, you'll be able to see this stuff in a lot of your team. But at the end of the day, your work day should start, look in the mirror and ask yourself a couple of questions, right? What is my level of fitness for duty, training, qualification, and competence for this task that I'm getting ready to do? Safety has to be task specific. Always remember that. We fall victim to making very generalized statements about what work we're getting ready to perform. And in the absence of it being task specific, we lose a lot of our ability to protect ourselves per the hierarchy of controls. And what I mean by that is a general statement, something that you might see on a lot of job briefings and whatnot is, I'm going to drive, okay? I want you to think about task specific. Task specific means there's a huge difference in me driving my personal truck and vehicle around the town that I'm from, in other words, in a very familiar environment, versus me jumping on an airplane somewhere, going somewhere I've never been, and renting a car and driving around. Now I'm driving a car that I've never driven before, hidden system responses, different places of where stuff works. There's nothing worse than getting in a rental car, and think about this, and you know, it starts raining and you're in a lot of traffic and the wipers just don't magically come on. And so that goes back to sometimes our over-reliance on other people and things to do stuff for us. But think about that task-specific qualification. And in this industry, we fall so victim to this person's got 20, this person's got 30, this person's got 40 years of experience. Therefore, they're really good at everything. That's not true. Safety has to be task-specific. So for the task that we're doing for the next 5 minutes, make safety very, very specific. How trained, how prepared, how competent, how qualified am I? A lot goes into the fitness for duty part of it. We're in South Carolina right now. Again, thank you to Brent for allowing us to be here, but it's summertime. It's gonna be hot. Part of that is properly nourished, hydrated, rested. Part of it's making sure you're not, a lot of times we limit our definition to that to, I'm not drunk and high on drugs today, so I'm fit for duty. There's a lot that goes into that. And really, a lot of that only you can control. So make sure that you are fit for duty, prepared, qualified, competent for the task that you're doing. Internal distractions. If I ask you a question right now and I said, what are you thinking about right now? You know, I would hope that what you're thinking about right now is this concept of a mirror as your most important PPE, how to do a self-evaluation or analysis before beginning work. But in reality, if you're really thinking about it, you're probably thinking about like what you've got to do the rest of the day, what's going on with your family, either what you had for breakfast or what you want for breakfast or lunch or whatever mealtime it is as you're watching this. In other words, we're very internally distracted. And the thing about that is we can't eliminate all those internal distractions. But if we assess task specific, this is a critical task. What we can do is focus 100% on that task for the next 5 minutes, so to speak. Again, we're making safety specific. So where is my focus? Is it on what I'm doing or is it somewhere else? And then we'll tie that concept into risk assessment and how we protect ourselves from hazards later. What is my perception of myself, my qualifications, back to that first bullet point that we talked about. What is my perception of the hazards associated with this task? Hazards don't change. What I mean by that is a chainsaw doesn't get less hazardous. We could probably maybe even argue over time, if we're talking about electrical systems, they're more amps, they're loaded more than they ever have been. They're probably more hazardous than they've ever been. All tools like chainsaws get bigger, faster, stronger, whatever you want to call them. They're probably more hazardous than they've ever been. So the hazard either increases or really doesn't change that much, but what changes is our perception about the hazard. So be very careful and aware of that. You have to have situational awareness to be able to work safe. And what's my attitude? What's my attitude towards this task? What's my attitude towards my crew leader, the rest of my team, the organization, towards safety? Well, you know, where am I in the right headspace? Do I have the right mindset for the task that I'm getting ready to do? Your level of motivation goes along with that. And a big one, right? Relying on common knowledge. Now, that seems to make sense, right? We should rely on common knowledge. The opposite of common knowledge is common sense. How many decisions and assumptions do we make about common sense? So I don't want to debate with you whether common sense exists, but I'll say this. Common sense may or may not exist at all, but it certainly isn't that common. And what I mean by that, think about something that you consider to be common sense. An example that I like to use, everybody thinks that it is common sense not to touch a stove that's real red and glowing because it's hot and we'll burn ourselves. That's common sense. It's really not. Some point in time in your life, you probably, against the better advice of people like parents and whoever, told you not to touch it. You touched it, you burnt yourself. It hurt. You gained common knowledge. It's common sense, maybe, to assume that other drivers aren't texting and driving. They're not distracted. It's common sense to assume that those other drivers, if we're at an intersection, are going to stop at their red light. That doesn't always happen. So you can't assume that everybody has the same level of common sense that you do for a given task. Always remember, anything, when we're talking about safety, if something's assumed, there's probably an opportunity for improvement. Common knowledge is verified. Common sense is assumed. So if you find yourself making decisions based on common sense, verify that in yourself and others. Make it common knowledge. Mindset we talked about a little bit. And then the big one, all right? And this is organizationally and as a team and as an individual, is what are we settling for? What are we settling for right now? We settle for, a lot of times, this is very dangerous in terms of safety. Decisions based on comfort and convenience. We settle for, talk about in a minute, the bottom half of the hierarchy of control. And the big one that I want to elaborate on for just a minute, we settle for compliance. And nothing wrong with compliance, but if you're familiar with standards and those sort of things, all standards are written to provide a minimum acceptable level of protection. So if you're compliant, you are settling for basically the least acceptable option, right? So if I'm in a vehicle and I've got my seatbelt on and I'm driving the speed limit or I'm stopped at a red light, I'm compliant. That doesn't mean I'm out of danger. Just because you're in compliance doesn't mean you're out of danger. I am compliant if I'm using proper work methods and whatever and wearing my PPE. That's compliant. But compliance should always be on the floor and not the ceiling. It cannot be the goal. It has to be the starting point. And far too often, we are just perfectly happy with compliance. So Jim Collins said it, right? Good is the enemy of great. And that is why we have so little that becomes great. I think that's true. You could replace that and say compliance is the enemy of safety. And that is the reason we struggle to be truly safe. We settle for compliance. And as we go through the remainder of our time together today, I'll explain what I mean when I say settling for compliance, and hopefully you'll be able to really work your way up the hierarchy of control during work planning and execution. So, what we've talked about so far is lead and protect people rather than managing robots and pleasing systems, and how to be self-reliant, how to create the right kind of culture. Now, and assuming we've done those relatively well, I really truly believe all you need to be able to do is to identify hazards, assess risk, and use the hierarchy of controls and mitigate those hazards. That's it. That's all you have to know to be able to work safely. And most people have seen some of the tools we're going to talk about. I don't think we've really ever challenged people to apply them and to their fullest potential, if you will. So let's start with this concept, soccer. I'm coaching a soccer team. How ridiculous would it look if my whole plan as a soccer coach was to send my goalie out on the field and say, go out there and just stop all the shots on our goal. That probably wouldn't be a great plan, and I probably wouldn't succeed very well. And so I want you to think about this. Shots on goal are hazards. How do we protect ourselves from those hazards? As silly as it looks just to send our goalie out there is exactly how silly it is just to put PPE on and hope it stops and protects us from all the hazards. So if we were really wanting some solid soccer strategy, we might start with, can we eliminate the hazard? We keep the ball the whole game. The other team never takes a shot on our goal. I've still got that goalie there. Remember when I said PPE, always use it, never need it? I got the goalie there just in case. But if the other team never takes a shot on my goal, I don't even need that goalie. Really? Think about it. And then, which is better? If the other team takes 75 shots a goal on my game, in my goal during the game, or if we can reduce that 75 to 50 or 25, right? We've reduced the amount of the hazard and our exposure to the hazard to a certain extent. So in that concept of never let the other team shoot, but have a goalie just in case, starts with this. And this is the energy wheel. A lot of you probably familiar with it. If you're not, please familiarize yourself with it. A lot of studies say somewhere between like 45 and 60%, I think, this helps you more accurately identify hazards. I love it as a tool because if you use it, it makes the protection from hazards very obvious and very logical. We identify hazards, what's the source of energy right now? And then we assess risk as how much energy there either is right now or could be, along with the amount of the energy. So if I'm driving, obviously it's motion. The amount of energy is how much traffic there is, how fast I'm driving, if I'm backing up, how often and how far I'm backing up, those sort of things. If I'm working from heights, there's a big difference between 2 feet off the ground and 20 feet up in the air. It's a greater hazard. So start there. What is the source of energy? Sound. Think about sound. Sound's a very good one, right? If we pretend for a second that this TV was a speaker, how do I protect myself from that sound? Go out and ask anybody involved that works around anything to do with noise tomorrow, and I almost guarantee you they'll start with wear earplugs. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But before I even think about earplugs, what could I do? Number one, I could just turn the speaker or the TV off. The sound is gone, right? Now, assuming whatever task I'm doing requires that the TV or the speaker be on, maybe I could cut the volume down, okay? Because what have I done now? I've reduced the amount of energy associated with the hazard. What's another thing I could do? If I'm standing right here, I'm right beside it. And maybe this is, if it's a jackhammer, it's 115 decibels. I come stand over here, what happened? I've now separated myself from the hazard. I've reduced my exposure to it. So that's this whole concept. If we identify hazards as what source of energy there is, and then we assess risk again as how much energy there either is or could be, along with how much I'm exposed to it, this becomes very logical. And this becomes very, very obvious, okay? And it's the hierarchy of controls. I hope you've seen it before. You've probably never seen it with this line. That's the line. Is our work planning above or below the line? Remember when I said we settle. If your whole work planning discussion is here's hazard, here's what PPE we're wearing, we're protected, let's go to work, settling for PPE, that's below the line. Go ask this question of everybody that operates a vehicle in your company tomorrow. How do you protect yourself from a backing accident? And I almost guarantee you the first two answers you're going to get, and there's nothing wrong with them. Goal, get out and look, 360-degree circle of safety, use a spotter. Those two things. Spotter, warning device, below the line. Get out and look, 360-degree walk around. Some people go as far as to put cones around the vehicle. I like that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's an administrative control. It's below the line. The conversation has to start with, can I eliminate the energy? Do I have to back up? And if you make that a very general statement about all the driving you'll do for the rest of your life, the answer to that is yes, you're probably going to have to back up. If we make it task specific to what I'm doing and where I'm going for the next 10 minutes, and again, we can't make decisions based on comfort and convenience. So let's say I'm going to lunch, right? Think about this. And let's say we're a line crew out in the field. We're going to go get lunch. We've got a big, huge commercial vehicle in the form of a digger derrick right here. We've got a foreman's truck right here. We can reduce the hazard by driving the foreman's truck, right? We have reduced the amount of energy. Where am I going to lunch? Little route planning, whatever. And where am I going to park when I get there? So the fast food restaurants here, there's a big mall here, comfort and convenience. I sacrifice having to walk 50 feet, pull through parking. I eliminate the need to back up because I made it task specific. And I didn't just settle for the fact that I've got a spotter or a backup camera, whatever it may be. So here's what that looks like for a given task. Is there a hazard? Yes. Can I eliminate the hazard? Most of the time, honestly, you can't. Can I eliminate the risk associated with the hazard, i.e. exposure to it? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. But if it's no, and this is the step that I feel like most people skip, can I reduce the energy and the exposure? And we need to spend more time talking about that. If we're talking about falls from equipment, on and off, in and out of the belly of trucks, how many times are we going up and down the steps? Through a little work planning, I've seen a lot of cases where an average of 50 times a day got reduced to an average of 15 times a day. What just happened, right? So can we reduce then we get into the true hierarchy of controls and what we settle for. So in my backing example that we were talking about, here's what this should look like. And I'll remind you, as you're doing this with your team, there are no bad ideas. We really need to come up with, this is almost like a little mini JHA for reference in our work planning later on. Start at the bottom, work your way up, have discussions about it. How do I truly protect myself from backing? How do I be 100% self-reliant? To be able to have these conversations, the run-up, developing relationship, creating culture, C5, safety leadership. Now we're into protecting people rather than pleasing systems. It pleases the system for me to do a 360-degree walk around. It pleases the system for me to have a spotter. It protects the worker not to back up or to reduce the amount of time or the amount of distance or the amount of speed we're backing at or the size of our vehicle. So here's what some of the things this may look like, right? If you own a boat, you understand that. I can protect myself with just put a bunch of rubber bumpers around my vehicle, back into all the stuff I want and I'm protected from. I'm compliant, right? Traffic vest might fall into PPE. We mentioned all these sort of warning devices. Nothing wrong with any of this stuff. It needs to be there. The administrative controls that we look like, that we talked about, including training, right? Administrative controls, by the way, are anything that influences how we work and our work methods or procedures. But now let's get into this. Let's really think about the difference between a backup alarm or a camera that just beeps and a collision avoidance system that actually stops the vehicle for us, okay? Now, balancing that with what we talked about earlier, self-reliance versus over-reliance on other people and things. That collision avoidance system, not a bad thing. We shouldn't over-rely on it, but it's not a bad thing. How about examples I gave? Here's my approved stop. Here's my approved parking lot. Can I reduce the size of my vehicle? And all that's good. Think now, we're getting back up into this area, reducing energy and exposure, and we're above the line, right? And as the farther we go up above the line, the better we get at protecting ourselves, and the less we actually need to do it. Think about this. Now we're into some of those same approved stops. Cushioning not in the rubber bumpers around your vehicle, but gauge yourself. Next time you pull up in an intersection, how close do you get to the vehicle in front of you, right? And so you're this close and that vehicle dies or whatever happens and can't move forward. What are you now forced to do? You forced yourself to have to back up when you didn't really have to. Pull through parking, route planning. I've seen people go as far in these conversations, right? And all ideas are not going to be practical. They may cost too much in terms of money or opportunity cost, but somebody said to me one time, we could disable the reverse gear so nobody could back up. I'm like, hey, that should, we're probably not going to do it, but it should go on the list. Everything should, all ideas to start with should be included. And then we choose which one of these we're going to do. Obviously, if I'm backing into a loading dock for materials or whatever, a lot of this stuff I can't do. I have to back up. And that's where I get into and need defense in depth, multiple layers of protection, the below the line. But for most tasks, if we make it task specific, we can achieve safety. It's all about understanding, identify hazards as energy, assess risk as how much energy either there is or could be, and then using the hierarchy of controls above the line work planning. So that's the key skill and the key thought that I want to leave you with, because you don't need really anybody's help to do that. Now, the better an organization can function, the better your team functions, the better your culture is, the more effectively you communicate, this is all going to work better. But when you're talking about your safety, remember, it is your safety. Make sure that you take responsibility for it. And as you go through some of these things, make sure part of your role is report back, near miss, near hit, good ideas. Share what you learn as you go through some of these processes. And so I'll just summarize. Again, lead and protect people rather than managing robots, pleasing systems. Realize that hazards and risk are quantifiable and predictable. If we can predict, we can prevent. Make sure that we're focused more on self-reliance than over-relying on other people and things like protective equipment to protect us. And then use the hierarchy of controls. It works. It works. It doesn't work real well if we just settle, if we just start with PPE. It works really, really well if we have a conversation and really think about, for this task, how can I protect myself? And so I mentioned earlier, there's a link if you want to check it out. The blue covered book is that. A couple of things if you want to learn more, if you enjoyed this presentation, things we do at Utility Business Media, and these are free. The monthly forum that we have, that's a place for just anybody in the utility industry to come and talk about challenges they face. Hopefully we can, with our panel of subject matter experts or your peers, come up with some solutions for those. I mentioned we publish a couple of magazines that are free. I really think it's worth you checking out. And so I will again close by thanking Brent and Bierer Meters for the opportunity to be here. ECOS, the electric culture of safety. Get involved with that. I love what they're doing. So honored to be a very small part of it. Honored to be here today. And everybody, take what we've talked about today to heart. It doesn't do any good to talk about it and listen to it in a virtual format or watch a recording of it or see it up on the screen. It does a heck of a lot of good when we apply it in the field. So turn the words to action. Stay safe. Be well. And thank you again.